We move on now to Psalm 120, a song of ascents. In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. O Lord, save me from treacherous lips, from a deceitful tongue. What can you profit? What can you gain, O deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows with hot coals of broomwood. Woe is me that I live with Meshech, that I dwell among the clans of Kedar. Too long have I dwelt with those who hate peace. I am all peace, but when I speak, they are for war. In Psalm 118, we have a similar sentiment that is expressed at the beginning of our psalm. There, in distress, I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and brought me relief. And here we have, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. In both cases, we have the psalmist in a situation of peril, distress, and suffering. And in both instances, he calls on the Lord, and God answers. God hears his prayer, and God responds. In this particular Psalm 120, we also have the reference to treacherous lips, deceitful tongue, hateful and harmful and deceitful speech, and how damaging and perilous that can be. And that reference is absent from Psalm 118, but it is found right here. I find it interesting that in both cases, the psalmist talks about calling on the Lord or crying out to God for help in times of distress and adversity. And I know in my own life, and I imagine those of you who are listening to this as well, have had times when you have really been at your wit's end and feeling as if you're standing on the precipice. And during that time, you cry out to God for help. You might say it inwardly, or you might say it outwardly, vocally. Help me, O God, get me out of this. Please deliver me from this sorrow, from this trouble, from this situation. It is common, and I think it's human nature, to cry out to God during times of trouble. How often do we acknowledge God during times of plenty, during times of good fortune, when everything seems to be going our way, when we are feeling happy and serene and settled, when we are feeling somehow impervious to trouble and suffering at any particular time in our life? That really ought to be the time when we engage with God and try to deepen and strengthen our connection with God at such good times in order to kind of fortify ourselves for any bad times that might be ahead. But during the good times, it's not as if we should strengthen and develop our connection with God's presence in order to, or primarily because we want to be prepared for the bad times. You recall in the Torah, the Joseph story, that Joseph instructs Pharaoh that there will be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph tells Pharaoh, during those 7 years of plenty, have the people and enforce a kind of a mandatory allocation and saving of grain, of food, that will carry through during the time of drought. In this case, I'm not really talking about getting a strong relationship with God in times of plenty so that during times of drought or adversity, we will be okay with God or God will be there for us. The purpose of developing a strong relationship with God is unconditional. It is not in order to or for the purpose of achieving some other end. No end other than having a close relationship with God. That is an end in itself. But a good byproduct of that is that if things are going well for us and we are cognizant of God, mindful of God, we worship God during those times, we develop a consciousness and awareness of God's presence in our lives in those times, we are thankful and grateful to God in those times, that can actually, as a byproduct, serve us well when times get rough, when times are difficult. We can then fall back on our faith and our belief and our strong relationship with the Holy One. And so that's number one. Number two, the last part of the psalm: woe is me that I live with Meshech, that I dwell among the clans of Kedar. These are a reference to two tribes or groups of people who were considered to be particularly barbaric and violent. And so the psalmist laments that he has to live in the company of extremely violent, amoral people. He says, too long have I dwelt with those who hate peace. And then he says, very startling, Ani Shalom, I am peace. The translation here is, I am all peace. Ani Shalom, v'chiyadaber, but when I speak, Hema la milchama, they are for war. I am all for peace, they are all for war. I am nonviolent, they are violent. And also because of the context of this psalm, and the reference to evil tongue, treacherous lips, deceitful speech, there is a reminder here, I think, implicitly, that violence is not only physical, but violence can also be verbal and vocal. The power of words to hurt, to wound, and to destroy is alluded to. When the psalmist says, I am all peace, his wish is to be nonviolent, not only in deeds and action, but also in words. His goal is never to hurt or harm anyone by what he says, but rather to use his words and his speech for the purposes of peace, and all the more so to avoid acts of violence against other people. Personally, I am all for nonviolence. I believe in the traditions of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. I believe in the power and value of nonviolent resistance. I understand that there are certain instances, such as, for example, the Second World War, or Israel's fight for independence, and other wars in which Israel had to defend herself against her enemies. There are times when people must bear arms and, unfortunately and tragically, have to commit acts of violence in order to defend themselves. But in our daily walks of life, I am all for avoiding violence. I am all for nonviolent protests. I am all for the protests that occur as a result of police brutality or unjust practices in our society, lack of equity, and so on and so forth. I'm all for nonviolent protests, but when they erupt into violence, then a situation of peace transforms into a situation of violence and hate, and that is something I believe that ought to be avoided at all costs. So violence, of course, hurts. Words and violent words hurt. In order to achieve and aspire to peace, we must do everything in our power to avoid all of those types of things, to try to find serenity in our words as reflected in our deeds, and to know that through those actions themselves and through those attitudes as well, we continue to strengthen our connection and relationship with God, whether it's during times of adversity or during times of good fortune and when times are good for us. God willing, those times should be in abundance. Often it is outside of our control. Either way, it is our job and our role, I think, as human beings, to be ever mindful of God's presence in our lives and to try to build and strengthen that relationship with God. Thank you.